Good afternoon. I suppose before I should start, I should just remind myself to stand up straight, as one of my former commanding officers is here to keep an eye on me today, Colonel Declan Power, who's partially responsible for me standing up here, as he facilitated my opportunity to go to university through the army. So you can thank him or throw buns at him later on, depending. It's good to be here in such august company and such a nice and fine array of speakers who have taken you through this current situation in a very effective way in terms of the research that's been done on the lone gunman, lone wolf theory. I think it's very important we hear more about that in the public sphere. Hearing from John about our own security preparedness, which I'll add a little bit to, and then Rob giving it to you from the Europol and European perspective. It's not that long ago I had the pleasure of hearing Rob's colleague Will van Gemmert. Did I pronounce it right? Almost. Yeah. It's a Dutch thing, you know. Don't tell him exactly. The Dutch aren't fond of their names being mangled. But he made some very interesting points about coordination and cooperation and communication. And if there's a lesson for us here in Ireland, it is this. We've spent a lot of time earlier today and last night hearing about the perils of Brexit. On no account should we let Brexit interfere with the necessary, ongoing security cooperation that needs to take place in these islands. And I say that, I know I'm preaching to the converted here, but I'm saying that as well to our policymakers. This is too serious to play around with. It's too serious to mess around and fashion into some sort of a silly political football. And, you know, unfortunately, we have people that don't fully, there's no malign intent, but they don't see the big picture. And one of the things I want to address today is the fact that what we're all talking about here today, our policymakers here and elsewhere in Europe need to be taking on board, because I have one particular fear. It's not that our practitioners aren't up to the job. It's that our policymakers aren't always literate in the particular subject matter and can sometimes derail necessary reactions and bog things down in discussions that are unhelpful and that sap energy and waste resources. And I'll give you two small examples that I just had personal experience of in recent times since the Nice atrocity, where I was involved in a discussion with a number of public representatives. And it wasn't too long before that well-worn old chestnut got thrown on about our dangers to this country because of Shannon Airport and its use by the US military. Forget the ideology here. It's such an obvious target. It's not likely to be a target. If you listen to what the previous speakers have said and the nature, the pattern of the current iteration of terrorism in Europe, there are much more juicy, softer type targets that we have to be aware of. I'm talking in a European-wide capacity, but also within Ireland, that we need to focus on, that we need to ensure that our practitioners are enabled to deal with. Because the terrorist isn't having big, in-depth conversations about foreign policy. What IS have become is the tabloid version of terrorists. They have supplanted Al-Qaeda. The drone strikes might have limited their capacity for command and control, but what finished them off were their own. IS, the new kids on the block. And Al-Qaeda weren't rough enough, tough enough, or fast enough for them. IS wanted something more brutal and simple. And by God have they delivered. And the reason they deliver is because of the potency of their message. They keep it simple. Radicalization is not rocket science. Think about it. We've all been radicalized. I was radicalized once. I joined an organisation called the Irish Army. Some of you are in GAA clubs or you've played rugby. It's a form of radicalization. You take on an ethos. You become part of a team. Your value system becomes infused with the values of the team. There's a lot of positive aspects to radicalization, and there are a lot of negative aspects to it. So, at the moment, we're in this cauldron of confusion. and people are frightened. And we're hearing people say things like, how can we protect against a guy getting into a truck? You know, the truck becomes a weapon because he's been weaponized. He's been psychologically weaponized. How can we defend ourselves against that? Well, we can. I'm an optimist. And I think most of you are too. And I'm also a realist. I think we have the capacity within Europe to contain this. A lady that's probably not known to a lot of you, but would be to my colleagues here behind me, Professor Louise Richardson, an Irish woman from Tramore in Waterford. She's a highly esteemed analyst on terrorism matters. She's also the deputy, if I have the terminology right, the deputy provost of Oxford University now. And she used to be president of St Andrews, which is an international centre for the study of political violence and terrorism. And she wrote a book called Talking to Terrorists, or what, I always mix it up, or What Terrorists Want. And essentially, she reminds us that terrorism is a weapon of the weak. If they had other means to capture your attention, they would do so. And so, what happens is, if we overreact, which is what terrorists want, we become force multipliers for them. We become their ball carriers. So the more hysterical we are, the more we rush into knee-jerk reactions, the more we're doing their job for them. And let's be quite clear, what is it that's being sought in terms of objectives with regards to the attacks in Europe? Well, one aspect of it, you've heard it already from Rob there. It's to take your attention away from the fact that IS, when it's being put up to them by a military entity that's capable of taking the fight to them, they bleed just like the rest of us. They've lost ground. They lost one of their senior strategists and thinkers, a Chechen named Omar al-Shishani. Did you know that? It was in the papers last week, page 23 or 24. But I'm sure everybody got stuck in the knee stuff that was in the early pages. So that's a big loss to them. They've lost ground outside of Mosul, south of Mosul. So when you get down into the grounds, into the weeds of it, and you look at it from a dispassionate military analytical point of view, they're not doing so well. But what's remarkable is that they're being tackled at all, because there's such a lack of will on behalf of the international community to actually do something to contain them. Now, I'm not going to get in, I don't want to get bogged down in the rights and wrongs of foreign policy mistakes or screw-ups that led us to this situation. If I can paraphrase Brian Cowan, dare I say it, we are where we are. Now we have to move forward, we have to get out of it. I think most people would agree, and I'm just focusing on this area for a moment, that within the Middle East, within Syria, this is not going to be solved with Western boots on the ground. We need a Muslim solution to a Muslim problem, a Muslim-led solution. But they're entitled to our help and support. As Jean-Pierre Fellou, a French former diplomat, writer and theorist with a lot of time under his belt in Syria, said on a visit to Dublin, are we going to be that capable of inverted imperialism that we stand back and we don't want to facilitate anything? Because we somehow say the Syrians aren't entitled to have their children brought up in safety, or the Syrians aren't capable of living the same kinds of lives as us. You see, we don't have the luxury of standing back. Standing back is what let IS develop in the first place. And when you hear people talk about airstrikes, I just want to put this into context. Airstrikes are what are necessary if you want a ground offensive to succeed, just to give you a soldier's eye point of view on this. So when the Peshmerga, the Kurdish Peshmerga, who are woefully and inadequately equipped, but who are doughty fighters, when they look for support, what they're looking for are forward air controllers to work with them, to coordinate air support, so when they go and take the fight to IS, they have the necessary air support. But we don't often hear that in this side of the world. It gets mired up, and it sounds like airstrikes are happening in a willy-nilly, ill-thought-out way, and just a knee-jerk reaction from the West, and that they're blowing asunder children and women and whatever else. Well, there's children and women dying, all right, in IS-controlled areas. And they're dying at the hands of IS, lest we forget that. And this brings me back now to Europe, to remind ourselves of what the objective is. You see, when we get attacked on our own territory, when it's people that we can relate to, Thankfully, this hasn't happened in Ireland. We're an island nation. We have a small Islamic population. But we're not cut off. The French are our partners and allies, friends. And we've holidayed in some of these places. So it's very easy to have the knee-jerk reaction and feel, this is a Muslim Western fight. But it's not, because every time we hear about Western blood being spilt, you can double, treble, quadruple that for the amount of Muslim blood that has been spilt by these ideologues and extremists within IS. So we need to bear that in mind, that the ordinary Muslim is getting brutalised by them. Now, let me jump further centric into Ireland. We have a tendency, when something like this happens, to look for answers for the Islamic community and to try and understand it from the Islamic community's point of view, which is sensible. But we need to remember there is more than one strand of Islam. I'm probably looking at a hall here where the majority of you either were reared or subscribed to some form of Christian teaching or philosophy. That's just a wild guess, okay? Clever like that. Now, that's probably where that's a common denominator, but that's probably where it ends. Your interpretation of Christianity could be quite radically different to the lady down at the back. And that's grand, that's fine. That's the beauty of living in our free and open society. But we need to remember that kind of dichotomy, that kind of divergence can exist within the Muslim community. So why then, whenever there is an outrage or an atrocity, do we tend to always produce the same spokesman from the same particular brand of Islam in this country? Why don't we get to hear from more? We're starting to. But I've had conversations with some of these guys, and they tell me how difficult it is to punch their way into your consciousness. And these are our allies. These are the people who stand up and say they support LGBT rights. They support the fact that they live in a society that respects that. They're the kind of people who stand up and say, hey, Ireland, wake up. There are 2 clerics being flown in here next week that have been banned from entering Holland after a debate in the Dutch Parliament that considered them to be too extreme to have access to young, impressionable minds. And when they do stand up, I can recall 3 particular clerics. One, a man who was reared in Holland, now based, he's an imam in Dublin, in Blanchardstown. Another one, an Irishman, Imam Noonan from Galway, and another one, a South African, whose name evades me at the moment. And the key point they were making was that they wanted to play a role in protecting their own community and also protecting Irish society. And what happened? In some cases, I won't say they were shouted down, but they were roundly patronised by people who would consider themselves to be flag carriers in the Irish left. People who didn't even listen to the point they were making, who said, how would you feel, how would I have reacted if I was going to the UK in the 1980s and people asked me to sign a declaration that I didn't support the IRA? Well, actually, I don't really care how you feel, because that wasn't the question. The question was people that are coming in here who have an influential role and who the Islamic community were asking that they be able to police themselves. And instead you had these wise fools interrupting the necessary, I would call it, debate that we need to facilitate in Ireland and in Europe between the different strands of Islam. Because this brings me now to my key point. Jerry mentioned some work that I've done over the past couple of years on and off in Africa to do with where the rubber meets the road, in fact. Counter-terrorism. You have a kind of a trinity in counter-terrorism. You have programs to do with countering violent extremism, countering radicalisation within the civil population, de-radicalisation programs within the prisons. The irony of it is, and it's not lost on me, and I'm sure it won't be lost on you, is that the European Union are funding an awful lot of these projects, and we need to start doing it in Europe. And notwithstanding what John has said about the outreach officers within An Garda Síochána, we need, as a society, and I'm not talking about just Ireland here, as a European society, and we in Ireland, I think, can be uniquely placed to influence this. And we should. We should take up the mantle on this because we're good at it. We have an innate understanding of it. It's in our cultural DNA based on how we came about as a nation. We understand the importance of identity. We understand how potent symbology is. For God's sake, look what we've been going through with the commemoration of 1916. Look at the struggle we had to take back the memory of 1916 from the men of violence. Look at the important differences that were made by using our defence forces, our legally mandated professional soldiers, to go into the schools with the flag so that our children can identify with the men and women who are mandated by the Constitution to protect this state. So we know essentially what has to be done. And what has to be done is this. We have to make a partnership with the Islamic community. We have to facilitate them to be able to not root out, nomenclature is very important, terminology is very important, for them to become aware, self-aware. Let me illustrate this further. What I mean by this is that the recent attack in Nice, you may remember, that the individual sent a picture of himself smiling. The media made much of this to his family. Now, if you read into it and some of the reactions by the family, they were a little bit puzzled at this. This was sort of slightly unusual behaviour. What we need is a situation whereby, particularly the Islamic community, because they are the community most at risk of being targeted for radicalisation, but all of us become more aware of things when people start to exhibit strange behaviour in our midst. And that, had there been an awareness within that family, and had there been the lines of communication between their community and law enforcement, somebody might have made a phone call at the right time, and in the space of 2 hours, a major tragedy, if not averted, might have been contained much more effectively. Now that's one aspect, that's probably an extreme aspect, but in case, lest you think I'm talking complete nonsense here, I'm not, because this isn't purely Declan Power dreaming this up. I'm basing this idea on concepts that already exist in how we deal with mental health issues. Suicidal ideation. We came to grips with that in the last couple of years. You know, the dangers of how these things come about, how young people are susceptible to mood changes, mood-altering, not just substances, but just mood-altering circumstances, and how important it is for the immediate family to be aware of shifts and changes in the personality. And that kind of awareness within families has led to a lot of young men and women being alive today because their families, their communities were more aware. They were able to make interventions at the right time. And essentially what I'm talking about here is delete suicidal ideation. Let's call it Islama ideation, where this extremism, and the reason it works so potently is because the kinds of people that are being targeted now in the more recent time, notwithstanding what Paul said there about it ranging from PhD candidates down to people with meagre educations. But we've seen a little bit of a pattern emerging recently in France. People that didn't have great education, weren't from particularly devout Islamic backgrounds. They were culturally Islamic, but they didn't know much about their own religion. They didn't know much about their own culture. And they're really malleable because they're looking for something to latch onto. And they're looking for something to make sense of their lives. And maybe, as has been the case so far, they're really teed off with life. They're really annoyed with their circumstances, rightly or wrongly. And add to that the rather disturbing development that a number of them have been petty criminals. Because that means they're known to the police, and that sort of normalises their, ODC, shall we call it, ordinary decent criminal activities, which makes it easy for them to hide in plain sight. So if a guy who has a reputation in the town of Nice, for example, for being involved in criminality, and it comes to the local police force's attention that maybe he has purchased a weapon, or maybe he has done something that wouldn't be out of tune with what they expect, they're not necessarily going to want to ring the Domestic Intelligence Service and say, we think we might have a major terrorist developing here, because it doesn't appear like that. So do you see what I mean? They're hiding in plain sight. So let's go back to basics here. How do we deal with this? We have to get into the community. And this can't be done purely by the police, although it will help if we start focusing on community policing techniques, but with police officers that are terrorism sensitive and that have also basic intelligence training. Because what we need to be focusing on are developing what our friends across the pond in the States call LENS, low-level intelligence networks. What I recall hearing about when I was in the Defence Forces, when we were in Kosovo, developing liaison monitoring teams to take the temperature of the communities that were at risk, and so prevent trouble from spiralling out of control, anticipating it. Now, these are the things that I think, and to an extent some of this has been done, but I think we need to up the game as a society within Europe. And the reason I say that is, look, Europe is great in many respects. An awful lot of the programs that I've been involved in Africa and the Middle East have been incredibly benign in their intent, sometimes maybe too benign, but it's incredibly bureaucratic as well and can be incredibly slow-moving. So if we come away with anything from our little chat and discussion here today, it should be the awareness that our public representatives need to be literate about this. We can't afford to be wasting time waffling about Shannon, or worse still, waffling about things like active neutrality, because that's not relevant. We're in a different environment. Stop looking to fight today's war with the strategy of yesterday's. That's a real recipe for disaster. And it's not even about fighting a war. It's about containing a number of things so that we can live in harmony and live safely. And I believe we have the capacity to do that. But it starts and ends with our development of situational awareness within the communities and self-awareness. And I'll just end on this point. I did a course once, many years ago in the army, and it just brought home to me in terms of perception, how powerful I think perception is. And somebody who was a long-serving, experienced NCO, a sergeant, who said, if you want to penetrate the security of any military barracks in this state, you need two things. And everybody said, oh, what, a rope ladder? Do we need some sort of rubber hose or a gadget? No, he said, you need either a clipboard or a brush. If you have a clipboard or a brush, you can go into any office anywhere within this state. It's as simple as that. Thanks.